Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Promise of an Angel by Ruth Reid, narrated by Rachel Dulude. For he shall give his angels charge over you, to keep you in all your ways. Psalm 91, verse 11. Chapter 1. Mecosta County, Michigan. The maple tree's crimson canopy offered shade for the children in Judith Fischer's charge, and a perfect place to stitch her quilt, while viewing Levi Plank as he worked with the men building the barn. With the structure nearly complete, soon the supper bell would ring. Judith glanced toward the house. Her friend, Deborah, was busy preparing the outdoor tables for the meal. Judith enjoyed helping with the food preparations, but she loved sitting with the children and entertaining them with stories more. 6-year-old Rebecca pulled on her sister's sleeve.
"Tell us another story."
Judith turned back and eyed the tight circle of smiling children. "What color dress will the maid'll wear?"
"Yellow,"
said Rebecca. Little Emily looked down at her own dark dress.
"Not black or blue."
A leaf fluttered from the branch above them and landed on Judith's lap. She picked it up and twirled it by the stem. "In stories, people wear bright colors." She tucked the red leaf into her tightly wound hair, leaving it to dangle from under the head covering. Storybook characters can also wear wildflowers and colorful ribbons in their hair. Rebecca raised her hand to shield the late afternoon sun from her eyes as she looked up into the branches. "What's her name?" Judith repositioned the younger girl's bonnet, then removed the leaf from her own hair and tucked the stem under Rebecca's head covering. Feeling a tug on her other arm, she looked down at her 5-year-old brother's gap-toothed smile. "Yeah, Samuel."
"Name her Judith."
The girls chimed in their agreement. Emily's eyes widened.
"I'll name the boy in the story."
Judith glanced toward the barn and spotted Levi on the roof. She watched as he removed a nail he'd been holding between his teeth and hammered it into the wood. Judith couldn't help but smile. Levi would make a perfect storybook hero.
"Let's call him Andrew,"
Emily blurted. "Andrew?" Judith echoed louder than she intended. She followed the child's gaze to Levi's cousin, Andrew Lapp, and watched as he measured a piece of lumber. He paused, holding the pencil in place against the wood, and smiling, turned toward the children. As his eyes met Judith's, he lifted his hand from the board and touched the brim of his straw hat. Rebecca scrunched her freckled nose as she looked at Judith.
"Why is your face red?"
Judith touched her warm cheeks. Before she could think of how to answer, she heard her sister Martha giggling behind her.
"Supper's ready,"
she said.
"That is, if the daydreamer is ready to eat."
Judith set the quilt section beside her and stood. Since Martha turned 17 last month, her entire demeanor had changed. Judith hoped her father would notice the way Martha sashayed to the barn. He'd have something to say about that. Judith lined up the children to brush the grass off their dresses, meanwhile watching Levi climb down the ladder out of the corner of her eye.
"Am I done?"
Emily asked. She looked at the girl's dress. "Yeah, run to your mom." Martha had managed to be at the foot of the ladder as Levi reached the ground. Sarah, Emily's older sister, fanned her dress by pulling on both sides, then twirled in place.
"What about me?"
After a few swipes, Judith sent her on her way. Her jaw tightened as she heard Martha and Levi laugh. She should be the one exchanging pleasantries with him, not Martha. She was the one turning 19 tomorrow. She shooed the other children toward the house without inspecting their clothing, but held back Rebecca and Samuel. "Samuel, you stay with Rebecca and me. Mom doesn't need to chase after you today." He pointed to the supper tables.
I'm hungry.
Judith could see Martha, Levi, and some other girls their age moving in her direction. She pretended to brush grass off Samuel's clothing. Mom wouldn't want you to come to the table covered with grass. Now hold still. Hello, Judith. Levi paused near the tree. Martha and the others clustered around him. You sounded happy being surrounded by children all day. Judith blushed. He had noticed her under the tree. She thought she'd seen him gaze in their direction a few times. Martha sighed.
She was filling their heads with nonsense again.
Judith gritted her teeth and didn't comment.
She's going to lead the children astray. They'll all want to wear lacy gowns and ribbons in their hair.
Martha pointed to Rebecca.
See? She has our sister wearing colorful adornments.
Rebecca's lips puckered, and Judith quickly patted the girl's slumped shoulders. It's okay. Martha used to listen to stories, too.
Before I turned 17.
Judith crossed her arms. And you think 17 makes you grown? Martha planted her hand on her hiked hip and shot her nose into the air.
At least I don't dream of fairy tales.
Judith hadn't noticed Andrew joining their group until he cleared his throat and stepped forward. He reached into his pants pocket and knelt in front of Samuel. I have something for you.
For me?
The little boy beamed. Andrew handed him a galvanized nail. After supper, I'll help you pound that into a piece of wood.
Really?
Samuel rolled the nail over his palm, eyeing it as if he held a fistful of candy. Andrew stood and dusted the dirt from his patched knees. Sure. You want to build barns someday, don't you? Samuel nodded.
And furniture, too.
Rebecca peeked around Judith's dress.
Andrew was the name of the boy in Judith's story.
Judith's breath caught as she glimpsed Andrew's raised eyebrows. She sent a furtive glance in Levi's direction, but he and the others were heading toward the house. Andrew squatted and picked up the quilt Judith had been sewing. Ouch! He shook his hand. I guess I stabbed myself with your needle. He handed her the fabric, taking care to point out where the needle was stuck. I hope I didn't dirty your work. Judith looked down at the squares. It'll come out in a wash, she hoped. When she married, she wouldn't want her wedding quilt marred. She reached for Samuel's hand and caught Rebecca before she darted away. You two need to wash for supper. Avoiding eye contact with Andrew, she hustled the children toward the house. As was the custom, the men stood on one side of the table, the women and children on the opposite side. While Bishop Lapp thanked God for the meal, the completed barn, and the day's fair weather, Judith glanced across the table at Levi. His thick, broad shoulders gave him a towering build. Hat in hand and head bowed, his sandy brown hair, damp with sweat, curled into ringlets and fell forward, covering his eyes. She stifled the sigh that threatened to escape. If her father caught her staring at a boy instead of giving thanks to God for their new barn, she would hear about it. She tried to keep her eyes closed, but as the bishop's prayer droned on and on, she couldn't keep from peering at Levi again. His eyes opened. He tipped his head enough to look between his coiled locks. Her heart quickened. Tomorrow she'd be 19. In her dreams, she had already accepted his courtship invitation. His glance passed over her toward the opposite end of the table. She leaned forward on her tiptoes and craned her neck to see what he was looking at. His gaze had stopped on Martha. Her long, batting lashes and perfect rose-glowing cheeks stole his undivided attention. Judith looked again at Levi. He shook his head as a broad grin spread across his face. She wondered what her sister had asked him and snapped her head in Martha's direction to see her sister's lips form an exaggerated pout. Disgusted at her inappropriate behavior, Judith turned her attention back to Levi to see him shrug at Martha. Judith squeezed her eyes shut and bit her bottom lip. This wasn't how she dreamed things would be when she turned 19. While a few of her friends dared to speak of what it would be like to live outside the Amish community, Judith valued household duties, knowing they prepared her for marriage. She performed each task with vigor, even unpleasant chores like scrubbing barn-soiled clothes against the washboard, while pretending to be Levi Plank's fra. Now his playful gestures toward her sister were unbearable. He talked about courting her once she turned 19. She had expected he would ask to take her home after the next singing. Judith felt a tug on her dress and looked down at Rebecca.
"Where's Samuel?"
the little girl whispered. Judith brought her finger to her lips. Even at age 6, children knew not to interrupt the blessing. She glanced to her other side, where her brother was supposed to be. Samuel was gone. She scanned the immediate area. He wasn't with her parents or with the other children. He wasn't anywhere. She drew a deep breath. Once the prayer ended, she would search for him. He wouldn't go far. She looked again at Levi, but a blur of blue in the distance caught her attention. Samuel was squatting on the barn roof with hammer in hand, tapping a board. Judith moved away from the table and ran toward the barn, prayer or no prayer. "Samuel!" Her voice boomed in the near silence. Samuel jerked upright, arms flailing. In the time it took to blink, he disappeared from view. Judith sprinted to the other side of the barn. "Please, God, let him be okay. He's just a child." She pushed herself to run faster. She rounded the corner of the barn and skidded to a halt. A man, an Englishman, was kneeling next to her brother. The man lifted his head away from Samuel's face. "The boy's alive." Judith collapsed to her knees as she stretched her hand to Samuel's pale face. "Samuel!" Her brother didn't respond or open his eyes. The Englishman rose to his feet. "Have faith. Samuel's steps are ordered by God." When she looked up at the man, his eyes flickered with a bright, wavering light. Her throat tightened, and she was unable to speak. Then the sound of the others approaching pulled her attention away. Her older brother, David, reached them first. "Samuel, wake up, please!" Judith wrapped her arms around Samuel and clung to his limp, unresponsive body. "God, please," she murmured. David's strong hands lifted Judith and set her aside as others swarmed around Samuel. "No, please don't!" Judith felt herself being pushed aside. "Don't cause problems," David warned. She drew in a hitched breath and wiped the tears from her eyes to clear her vision. From somewhere nearby, a voice resonated in a language she'd never heard. While everyone's focus remained fixed on Samuel, she turned a complete circle in search of the source. The voice sounded like that of the stranger she'd found next to Samuel. How had he known her brother's name, and where had he gone? Filled with an urgent need to find him, she followed the sound of the harmonious chant and spotted the man crossing the pasture, heading into the apple orchard without looking back. She moved cautiously at first, then with a surge of determination, she lifted her skirt and broke into a full run. She lost sight of him, cloaked as he was in the undergrowth of the dense branches and an emerging thick haze that seemed to seep up from the ground. The fog turned solid at her feet, preventing her from following his tracks. He had disappeared. She shivered at the memory of his penetrating stare, as though she'd looked at the sky through an icicle. His frosty blue eyes etched her senses. Oddly, her core warmed with an inner peace. A whoosh of wind, followed by a sound like sheets flapping on a clothesline, startled her. The murky vapor had cleared, and now shadows from the low-hanging branches filled the empty void. Somehow she knew it was pointless to follow, and she turned back. Once clear of the grove, she sprinted across the pasture, hoping that no one had noticed her absence. Her heart still pounding hard, she steadied her breathing before she edged back into the crowd. Her father was raising the rear wooden panel off the market wagon as the men lifted a board that held Samuel. They carried his limp body like pallbearers carrying a pine box. Judith raced to catch her mother before she climbed into the buggy. "Where are they taking him?" Mom lowered a handkerchief from her face. "He needs a doctor. You'll stay with your sisters." Judith saw Rebecca clinging to Martha. Both stared blankly as they looked on in silence. Then she glanced at Samuel's white complexion, eyes closed, unresponsive. The vivid impression embedded itself into her mind. "Judith." She looked up at her father. "Keep your eye on the girls." His stony expression drove a nail through her heart. It was her failure to supervise Samuel that had caused the accident. Her eyes welled up at the thought of her brother dying on her watch. As the buggy pulled away, her vision blurred again, with tears. Chapter 2. Judith cupped her hands over her mouth, muting any outward emotional display. She understood the scriptures. God's will for Samuel would prevail, regardless of what bartering she offered on his behalf. Yet with her mind swirling with what-ifs, she had to offer. "Take my life in exchange. I'm to blame." Auntie Lily tugged Judith's sleeve. "Kuma, we'll red oop." She drew in a snagged breath and nodded. Perhaps if her hands had work, she'd ward off the temptation to question God's ways. Judith followed the women back to the food-laden tables. Surely, after the men had labored all day, they would wish to eat. At the moment, they were still hovering near the barn, no doubt discussing chore duties. In their tight community, all hands pulled together in times of crisis. She'd spent several days herself helping with household chores for the Trombleys when all 5 of the children came down with chickenpox. Judith smiled, recalling how little Emily had begged for stories to take her mind off the itching. Martha elbowed Judith's ribs. "Samuel almost died, and you're smiling." "My mind wandered briefly is all." Judith picked up a pan of beef casserole. The cheesy top layer was stiff. Much of the food would require reheating. Martha came along beside her, carrying a crock of baked beans. "We know what happens when your mind wanders, don't we?" David's wife, Ellen, stopped midway up the porch steps and spun around. "Leave the finger-pointing be, Martha. What has happened cannot be undone." Her gaze switched to Judith, and her eyes were warm with sympathy. "Once I make up some plates of food to take along, I'll take Rebecca and Martha home with me for the night." "Dengi," Judith replied. She certainly had no energy to hold her tongue while Martha barraged her with insults all evening. Martha let loose a wayward sigh and stormed into the house. "I'll ask your brother to speak with her," Ellen said. Despite her sister's poor behavior, Judith didn't wish David's discipline to fall on her. He used to be mild-natured, and Judith had loved his sense of humor. But after he became a church deacon, he held his siblings to a sometimes unreachably high standard of obedience. Working with the bishop to keep the sheep from straying and the fold intact meant he kept a watchful eye over his immediate family. Judith stepped inside the crowded kitchen, where the women were quickly bringing order out of kitchen chaos. Dishes were passed hand to hand in an assembly line style, making plates available to take home and reheat. Judith found a place to work next to Deborah.
"So, what did he say?"
Deborah's head bobbed at the window facing the barn's direction.
"Levi," she mouthed. "Under the tree?"
Judith wrapped up 2 plates of food and handed them to Deborah, then picked up 2 more. "Ellen, we're taking these out to your buggy." She motioned for her friend to follow. The screen door hadn't snapped closed before Deborah asked,
Did he say anything about you turning 19, Maya?
Judith shook her head. I thought he might later, but Deborah's eyes widened.
Ugh, poor Samuel.
Yeah, I feel awful. Deborah gently elbowed Judith's arm.
You're not to blame.
He was under my watch. The strain in her voice made it barely audible, but she forced herself to continue. I was more interested in watching Levi. Silence fell between them until they reached the buggy. And guess who Levi was watching? Judith opened the back hatch and set the plates on the floorboard.
Who?
Judith closed the buggy door. Martha.
Nay, are you sure?
Yeah. Judith gazed off in the distance at the setting sun as tears welled. She'd waited patiently to court Levi, planned their wedding in her dreams, and now her sister had gained his attention. Deborah patted her arm.
Your faith is strong for Levi being the one. Besides, according to your parents' rules, Martha isn't old enough to court, is she?
I hope she cannot change their minds. She wiped her eyes. I have no business to speak of Levi when my brother's fate is unknown. Please don't think poorly of me. My mind's flushed with scattering thoughts. Did you see the Englisher?
Was? What Englisher?
Deborah's brows arched. He was kneeling beside Samuel.
I couldn't even see Samuel, not with so many people crowding around.
She looped her arm with Judith's as they strolled to the house. There was an Englisher with him? Yeah. Strange, isn't it? Odder still that she didn't hear anyone else talking about the man, as though he'd slipped through the entire crowd unnoticed. Did you talk to him? Judith was about to tell her friend what the man had said when the door opened. The chatter of children filled the air as they chased after one another over to the row of buggies. Deborah's mother came up beside Judith. Be sure to send us word about Samuel.
Yeah, I will.
Judith glanced at the house as more womenfolk stepped outside. She caught sight of Martha craning her neck in their direction. This wasn't the time to share what the stranger had said. Her sister would accuse her once again of spreading stories. She leaned toward her friend. I have more to tell you later. A wide smile spread across Deborah's face.
Yeah, you better.
She turned and caught up with her mother. Ellen came up beside Judith, and they waited as several buggies passed them on the driveway.
Auntie Lily is arranging a women's get-together.
Rebecca reached for Judith's hand.
Will Samuel die?
Her pale blue eyes probed Judith's, awaiting an answer. Judith gulped. Nay, Rebecca. He will be all right. But Ellen picked up Rebecca and guided her into the back of the buggy. That will be up to God. She motioned for Martha to climb in, then turned to Judith. It's hard sometimes to accept his will. Judith bowed her head. She hadn't intended to discount God's sovereignty. She just wanted to comfort her little sister and offer her hope. Ellen touched Judith's arm. Samuel is in God's hands. That is true, I know. Judith glanced into the buggy. Rebecca had nestled into Martha's arms. You girls be goot for Ellen. Ellen scanned the yard. Where did my boys run to? Judith glanced toward the barn. Doubtless the new building had offered the 9-year-old twins a wonderful set of discoveries to explore.
Want me to look for them?
Martha already had one leg out of the buggy. I'll go. Judith hurried away, hoping Ellen would keep Martha from following. The scent of fresh-cut lumber met Judith the moment she stepped into the barn. She drew in a deep breath, allowing the aroma to penetrate her senses. Most of the men had packed up their tools and were heading home to complete their own evening chores, but she could see Levi scattering straw over the calf pen, and Andrew and Uncle Amos milking cows. Judith lifted her gaze to the empty loft. Have you seen James and Jacob? She asked Levi. The boys poked up their heads from behind one of the horse stalls.
We're helping Auntie Judith.
James came out of the stall and wiped the hay dust from his pants. The boys, although not identical twins, both had their father's thick mop of sandy-colored hair. Judith motioned toward the door. Your mom is ready to go. Jacob leaned the pitchfork against the wall, and James passed Levi the feed bucket. With David having gone with Judith's parents to the hospital, the twins would have plenty of farm chores to do at home. Judith followed them to the door, then paused and looked over her shoulder. There's plenty of food in the house. She made it a general invitation, but she hoped Levi would stay. Levi crawled out from the calf pen. I could use a good meal when I finish here. Judith smiled. Already a heated plate. Back outside, the evening air had turned chilly. Judith shot a short wave at Ellen pulling out from the driveway, then wrapped her arms around herself. She wished she'd remembered her cape. Her thoughts drifted to Samuel and how pale, even cold, he looked with the bluish hue around his lips as he lay stretched out on the board. She hoped one of her mother's quilts was in the buggy for him to snuggle under during the ride home. Judith walked back to the porch. She'd need a light to gather firewood. Even if her parents returned tonight, her father would be too exhausted to stock the woodbox. After locating the wooden matchsticks on the windowsill, she readied the wick on the lamp. Shielding her hand around the lit match so the breeze didn't blow out the flame, she held it over the wick. The sound of someone clearing his throat caused her to jump. I didn't mean to startle you. Andrew motioned to her hand. Watch out, it's... Before he could finish his statement, the flame reached the end of the match and burned her fingers. She threw it from her hand, and they both stomped. Andrew's shoe smothered the flame, and Judith's shoe slammed onto his. Ugh, I'm sorry. He motioned to her hand. Did you get burned? Yeah, she replied, and jammed her fingers into her mouth to soothe the pain. Kuma, put water on it. Andrew motioned to the well pump. I'll be okay, she insisted, but Andrew had already turned and walked to the well. He pumped the handle to prime the well while she held her hand under the spigot. He worked the pump with such force the water gushed out, splattering Judith's dress and soaking her shoes. I'm so sorry. He released the handle, but the primed water continued to pour out. Judith chuckled. He didn't seem to know his own strength. Any time she primed the pump, she needed to put all her weight into each thrust, and it still took 5 or 6 times before water started spitting out. I guess this is what I get for stomping on your foot. How is the burn? Numb, if she dared to complain. Dousing with icy well water during the fall season had a tendency to deaden the nerves. Poor Andrew worked his hands together like he was wringing water from a rag. His nerves seemed as flimsy as the threadbare patches that covered the knees of his pants. Although older than the unmarried youth, he didn't seem to have many social skills around women. He was shy, Judith supposed, or maybe just contentedly single. In any case, he was known to be more studious of the Bible and considered wiser than the other young men in their community, probably because his father was the bishop. He surprised her by reaching for her hand. Let me look. Now she was trembling. I'm all right. Besides, hadn't it dawned on him that he couldn't see if a blister had formed now that the sun had set? Your hand is cold. He dropped her hand as if the reality of his action had startled him. I'll be by in the morning to do your dad's chores. His words ran together as if he were the one now shivering. Dengue. Dat will be grateful to have help. I'll be praying for Samuel, he said. A lump formed in her throat, and Andrew took a step closer as if he sensed how difficult it was to reply. He jammed his hands inside his pockets. I'll be praying for you too. Judith sucked on her bottom lip and nodded. She wouldn't deny needing prayer, but Andrew...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?